The morning of March 15, 1944, a battery of 4 88mm flak guns dug into the hillside overlooking the Anzio beachhead. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, 23 years old, watched the horizon through binoculars as dawn broke over the Mediterranean. His crew had been at this position for 6 days. In that time, they had fired over 800 rounds at Allied aircraft and survived 2 direct artillery strikes that killed 11 men from neighbouring batteries. What Richter didn't know, what none of the flak crews positioned around Anzio understood, was that every time they fired, they were sending a mathematical death sentence to themselves. The bright muzzle flash, the distinctive smoke signature, the sound that carried for kilometres, each element was being detected, triangulated, and processed by Allied counter-battery systems, operating with a speed and precision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Within 90 seconds of his guns opening fire, Allied artillery observers would have his exact position. Within 4 minutes, shells would be falling on his emplacement with devastating accuracy. By the end of March, 89% of Richter's battery would be dead or critically wounded. The story of how flak gun crews became the most dangerous job in the German military is not a story of Allied air superiority or overwhelming firepower alone. It is the story of how technology transformed artillery warfare from an art of approximation into a science of precision killing. It is the story of men who believed their concrete bunkers and camouflage nets made them invisible, never knowing that Allied forces could locate them within seconds using systems the German High Command didn't know existed. This is the account of the hidden massacre that decimated Germany's anti-aircraft defences, told through the eyes of the crews who never understood what was killing them until the shells were already falling. If you're enjoying this deep dive into this story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 88mm flak gun had entered the war as Germany's technological triumph. By 1944, it had become a crew death sentence. To understand this transformation requires understanding what made these weapons so vital to German strategy and why their crews found themselves targeted with an intensity unprecedented in warfare. The Flak 36 and Flak 37 variants that dominated German air defences by mid-war were sophisticated weapons requiring extensive crews to operate effectively. A standard heavy flak battery consisted of 4 guns, each requiring a crew of 10 to 12 men for sustained operation. The battery commander coordinated fire, the range operator calculated altitude and distance, the fuse setter adjusted shell detonation timing, the loader handled the 50-pound shells, the gunner aimed the weapon, and additional crew members managed ammunition supply, maintained equipment, and operated auxiliary systems. These were not simple weapons that could be operated by untrained personnel. Effective flak gunnery required mathematics, precise timing, and coordination. The shells used time fuses that had to be set for the exact altitude where bombers would be when the shell arrived, a calculation requiring knowledge of aircraft speed, direction, altitude, wind conditions, and shell ballistic characteristics. Even with mechanical computers to assist, experienced crews needed sustained training to achieve acceptable accuracy. The complexity created a personnel problem that worsened throughout the war. Germany's military doctrine emphasized offensive operations, tanks, aircraft, and infantry that could seize territory. Anti-aircraft defense was defensive, unglamorous, and consumed enormous resources for limited visible results. As casualties mounted on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, the Luftwaffe's flak arm became a dumping ground for men considered unsuitable for combat roles. By late 1943, typical flak batteries mixed a few experienced specialists with older men, recalled from reserve, teenagers from the Hitler Youth, wounded veterans no longer fit for infantry service, and increasingly, young women who handled communications and radar operations. These improvised crews operated Germany's most technically demanding weapons against an enemy whose industrial and technological advantages grew every month. The mathematics of their situation were brutal. Allied bombing campaigns prioritized destroying German industry, but flak positions defending those industries became equally important targets. Every time a flak battery opened fire, it revealed its position. In the early war years, this mattered less. Allied artillery was less accurate, Counter-battery fire took time to organize, and German forces often had mobility to relocate after firing. By 1944, everything had changed. The technological revolution in Allied counter-battery warfare began with radar, but extended far beyond it. The British had developed radar-based gun-laying systems in 1942. The Americans mass-produced them with automotive efficiency in 1943. By the time of the Anzio landings in January 1944, Allied forces possessed integrated fire control networks that could detect, locate, and engage German artillery positions with previously impossible speed and accuracy. The SCR-584 automatic tracking radar that decimated the Luftwaffe also revolutionized counter-battery warfare. Originally designed for anti-aircraft fire control, Allied artillery officers quickly realized its potential for locating enemy guns. The radar could detect muzzle flashes at ranges exceeding 20 kilometers, far beyond visual observation. More importantly, it provided exact coordinates automatically, eliminating the time-consuming process of manual triangulation. When combined with the American M9 gun director and British sound-ranging equipment, Allied forces possessed a counter-battery system of devastating effectiveness. German guns would fire. Multiple detection systems would simultaneously locate them. Coordinates would be computed automatically and transmitted to Allied artillery batteries, and shells would be in flight toward the German position while its crew was still loading their next round. The time from German muzzle flash to Allied return fire had compressed from hours in 1940 to minutes by 1944. For stationary flak positions defending cities and industrial facilities, this meant certain death. They couldn't relocate quickly. Their concrete emplacements and ammunition bunkers required days to construct and couldn't be abandoned casually. They had to stay in position and continue firing, even as Allied counter-battery fire zeroed in with increasing precision. The flak crews around Anzio learned this reality through systematic destruction. The beachhead, established by Allied amphibious assault on January 22, 1944, created a confined battlefield where both sides could concentrate enormous firepower. German forces, initially surprised by the landing, quickly surrounded the beachhead and subjected it to constant artillery bombardment. Allied forces, contained within a perimeter measuring roughly 15 by 25 kilometers, possessed complete observation of German positions and overwhelming artillery superiority. German flak batteries defending the approaches to Rome found themselves in an impossible situation. They had to engage Allied aircraft attacking supply lines and troop concentrations, but every time they fired, they drew return fire from Allied artillery that could call upon naval gunfire support from destroyers and cruisers offshore, in addition to the massive artillery park assembled within the beachhead. The testimony of survivors provides glimpses into what this experience meant for the crews. Gefreiter Hans Weber, a loader in a Flak 36 battery positioned near Cisterna, survived the battle and later provided a detailed account to American interrogators. His battery had arrived at Anzio on February 2, 1944, with full complement 48 men operating 4 guns plus support personnel. We dug in immediately, Weber recalled. The position was well chosen, on elevated ground with good fields of fire. We built concrete walls around the guns, covered the ammunition bunkers with earth and timber, strung camouflage nets everywhere. Our battery commander, Hauptmann Steiner, had fought in Russia and France. He was experienced and careful. We believed we were safe. The battery first engaged Allied aircraft on February 4th. American bombers, flying very high, Weber described. We fired perhaps 60 rounds. I think we damaged 1 aircraft, maybe 2. We were pleased. This was easier than Russia, where Soviet fighters would strafe our positions constantly. The counter-battery fire arrived within 3 minutes. I was in the ammunition bunker when the first shells hit. American 155mm, very heavy. 6 rounds landed directly in our position. 1 gun was destroyed completely. The crew of 5 men died instantly. Another 8 men were wounded. This happened before we could even cease firing and take cover. Hauptmann Steiner immediately recognized the danger. The Americans had located them with impossible speed and accuracy. He ordered the battery to new positions 600 meters away, a move requiring 2 days of frantic digging and transport of ammunition. "We thought the new position would be safer," Weber explained. "We were more careful with camouflage." Hauptmann Steiner said we must fire less frequently, only at the most important targets. The new position lasted 4 days. On February 11th, the battery engaged a formation of Allied fighter bombers attacking German positions near Aprilia. "We fired perhaps 40 rounds," Weber stated. "We hit nothing. The American planes were too fast and maneuverable." While we were still firing, the American artillery began. This time it was different. Not 6 shells, but dozens, falling in a pattern that covered our entire position. They knew exactly where we were. The bombardment lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, 2 of the battery's 3 remaining guns were destroyed. 17 men were dead, including Hauptmann Steiner. 21 were wounded. The survivors, including Weber, were transferred to another battery that had also suffered severe casualties, consolidating the remnants of 2 units into one understrength battery. "We understood then that we could not survive," Weber said. "Every time we fired, the Americans would destroy us, but we had orders to continue engaging enemy aircraft. We were trapped. To fire meant death. To refuse to fire meant court-martial and death. We continued firing and dying. The pattern Weber described repeated across every German flak position at Anzio. Batteries would arrive, dig in, engage Allied aircraft, and within days or weeks be destroyed by counter-battery fire of devastating accuracy. Replacements would arrive, take over the shattered positions, and the cycle would repeat. By the time Allied forces broke out of the Anzio beachhead in late May, German flak defences in the sector had been effectively annihilated. The official casualty figures, where they exist in fragmentary German records, confirm the massacre. The 3rd Flak Division, responsible for air defence around Anzio and the approaches to Rome, reported in April 1944 that 73 of its heavy flak batteries had been rendered combat ineffective since February 1st, due to personnel casualties exceeding 75%. This represented approximately 1,200 guns destroyed or abandoned and over 10,000 casualties among gun crews and support personnel. These losses occurred not primarily from air attack, but from Allied artillery fire. The irony was bitter. Anti-aircraft guns designed to shoot down bombers were being destroyed by ground-based artillery firing conventional high-explosive shells. The crews never saw their killers, never had the satisfaction of engaging the enemy, destroying them, and died in positions they had believed were protected. The technology enabling this slaughter remained largely mysterious to German forces. They understood they were being located quickly after firing, but attributed this to conventional observation methods, forward observers with radios, aerial reconnaissance, or visual triangulation from multiple positions. The existence of automatic radar-based flash spotting systems remained unknown to German tactical commanders throughout the Anzio battle. This intelligence failure had devastating consequences. If German commanders had understood the talent, technology locating their guns, they might have developed countermeasures, more frequent position changes, coordinated firing to overwhelm Allied systems, or simply reduced engagement rates to minimize exposure. Instead, they continued operating under doctrines developed for a different technological era, sending crew after crew to predictable deaths. The American forces besieging the Anzio beachhead possessed counter-battery resources of staggering scope. The 6th Corps Artillery, commanded by Brigadier General Robert Young, controlled over 300 artillery pieces, ranging from 105mm howitzers to massive 8-inch guns. These were supplemented by naval gunfire from destroyers and cruisers offshore, capable of delivering shells weighing up to 240 pounds, with increasing accuracy thanks to radar-directed fire control. The counter-battery organization operated with industrial efficiency. Forward observers, equipped with radios, and trained in rapid target identification, provided continuous surveillance of German positions. Sound-ranging units, using microphones positioned at multiple locations, detected the distinctive sound signature of different artillery weapons and calculated firing positions through triangulation. Radar units provided instantaneous flash detection and ranging. Flash spotting teams using optical instruments provided backup confirmation. All this information flowed to the Counter-Battery Intelligence Center, where officers plotted enemy positions on detailed maps and prioritized targets. Within minutes of a German battery opening fire, its coordinates would be transmitted to multiple Allied artillery batteries, each calculating firing solutions to deliver converging fire on the target. The Germans called this annihilation fire, concentrated bombardments designed not merely to suppress, but to completely destroy enemy positions. The effectiveness of this system is documented in American after-action reports. The 62nd Field Artillery Brigade reported in March 1944 that of 137 confirmed counter-battery missions conducted that month, 109 resulted in destruction or silencing of the target battery within the first fire mission. This 80% success rate represented a revolution in artillery warfare. For comparison, during World War I, counter-battery fire typically required hours of preparation and dozens of ranging shots to achieve effect. In World War II's early years, successful counter-battery fire still required sustained engagement and was often inconclusive. By Anzio in 1944, Allied forces could locate and destroy enemy artillery positions faster than those positions could be relocated, a decisive technological advantage that rendered static defense suicidal. The German Flak crews paid the price for this disparity. Unlike mobile field artillery that could displace after firing, heavy flak positions were essentially fixed fortifications. The guns weighed several tons each, required concrete foundations for stability, and needed extensive ammunition, storage, and crew facilities. A complete heavy flak battery represented weeks of construction effort and couldn't be moved on short notice. This immobility transformed them into target galleries for Allied counter-battery fire. Once located, they would be registered, meaning Allied artillery had calculated precise firing solutions and could engage them instantly. Even if German crews ceased firing and took cover, they remained vulnerable. Allied artillery would periodically bombard registered positions to prevent their reoccupation, turning entire areas into kill zones. The psychological impact on surviving crews was devastating. Soldiers can accept danger when they believe their actions matter, when they can fight back effectively. The Flak crews at Anzio found themselves in a different situation. Their weapons were largely ineffective against fast-moving Allied aircraft, yet using those weapons drew overwhelming retaliation from an enemy they couldn't see or engage. Gefreiter Weber described the psychological deterioration in his battery during March 1944. Men stopped sleeping. We knew the American artillery observers were watching us always. When clouds covered the sky and we thought we were hidden, we later learned they had radar that could see through clouds. There was no hiding. Some men refused to man the guns. Others became reckless, volunteering for every mission because they had stopped caring about survival. The discipline problems in flak units around Anzio became severe enough that the Luftwaffe had to rotate entire batteries away from the front for rest and replacement. But the replacements faced the same impossible situation and suffered the same casualties, creating a cycle of destruction that consumed thousands of men through the spring of 1944. The experience at Anzio was not unique. Wherever Allied forces could establish observation and concentrate artillery, German flak positions suffered similar casualties. In Normandy, after D-Day, around the Falaise pocket in August 1944, during the Ardennes offensive in December, the pattern repeated with mechanical consistency. Flak guns would engage Allied aircraft, counter-battery fire would destroy the positions, and the crews would die without ever seeing the systems killing them. The technology destroying German flak crews extended beyond radar. Allied forces had developed an integrated counter-battery system where multiple technologies reinforced each other to create previously impossible accuracy. Understanding this system explains why German casualties were so catastrophically high and why German countermeasures proved ineffective. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Sound ranging, pioneered by the British in World War I and refined to high precision by 1944, used networks of microphones to detect and locate artillery fire. The system exploited the fact that different weapons produced distinctive sound signatures that travelled at known speeds. By precisely measuring the time, artillery sounds arrived at multiple microphones positioned in a surveyed network. Computers could calculate the firing position through triangulation. The British sound-ranging sections attached to core artillery typically operated 6 to 8 microphone positions spread over several kilometres. Each position contained sensitive microphones connected by cable to a central recording station where operators measured sound arrival times with precision of hundredths of a second. The calculations required specialised training, but by 1944 had become routine. A sound-ranging section could provide accurate coordinates of enemy batteries within 3 to 5 minutes of firing. The Americans supplemented sound ranging with flash spotting, using surveyed observation posts equipped with specialized optical instruments to observe muzzle flashes from enemy artillery. Multiple observation posts would simultaneously observe a flash and measure its position relative to known reference points. When plotted on detailed maps, the intersection of multiple bearing lines provided accurate location of the enemy weapon. Flash spotting was faster than sound-ranging coordinates could be provided within 2 minutes, but required visual observation, and thus didn't work in darkness or poor weather. Sound ranging worked in all conditions but took longer. The two systems complemented each other perfectly, providing redundant capability that ensured enemy positions could be located regardless of conditions. The radar systems added a third layer. The SCR-584 and similar radars could detect muzzle flashes through their bright infrared signature, visible to radar even through smoke and clouds. While originally designed for aircraft tracking, artillerymen quickly exploited this capability for flash detection. A radar could provide instantaneous bearing and range to a firing position, faster than either sound ranging or optical flash spotting. When all three systems, sound ranging, flash spotting, and radar detection operated together, they provided triple redundancy and extraordinary accuracy. A German battery firing at Allied positions might be simultaneously detected by radar, observed by flash spotting teams, and located by sound-ranging microphones. The coordinates from all three sources would converge at the counter-battery center, providing confirmation and allowing immediate engagement with high confidence in target accuracy. The speed of this system shocked German forces accustomed to more leisurely artillery duels. Oberleutnant Friedrich Haus, a Flak battery commander captured near Florence in September 1944, provided detailed testimony about his experience facing Allied counter-battery fire in Italy. We arrived at our position near Prato on July 12, 1944. The position had been prepared by engineers, with concrete foundations for the guns and bunkers for ammunition and crew. We had 4 Flak 37 guns and full ammunition supply. Our mission was to defend the ammunition dump and rail junction from American bombers. On July 15th, we engaged American bombers for the first time. They were flying very high, perhaps 7,000 meters. We fired approximately 120 rounds over 20 minutes. We believed we damaged at least 2 aircraft based on observed smoke trails, though we couldn't confirm kills. The American artillery response began while we were still firing. I was in the command post when the first shells arrived. I counted perhaps 60 shells in the first 2 minutes, all landing directly in our position. The accuracy was impossible. Every shell fell within our battery perimeter, as if the Americans were using map coordinates we had provided them. 2 guns were destroyed in that first bombardment. 14 men died, including my executive officer. Another 17 were wounded severely enough to require evacuation. We had been combat effective for exactly 3 days. Haus's battery received replacements and continued operations, but the pattern repeated. Each time they engaged Allied aircraft, return fire arrived within minutes with devastating accuracy. By August 20th, when American forces overran their position, the battery had suffered 91 casualties from an original strength of 48 men, a casualty rate of 190%, meaning the position had been reinforced twice, and those replacements had also become casualties. I concluded that continuing to fire our weapons was suicide, Haus stated. But we had orders. The Luftwaffe command insisted we continue engaging enemy aircraft regardless of casualties. They seemed to believe we were being destroyed by air attack, or that we were somehow at fault for not camouflaging properly. They never understood that the Americans had technology that made camouflage irrelevant. The German institutional failure to understand Allied counter-battery capabilities stemmed from several factors. First, the technology was genuinely revolutionary and difficult to comprehend for officers trained in earlier doctrines. Sound ranging and flash spotting were known techniques, but their refinement to near-instant accuracy seemed impossible without experiencing it directly. Second, German intelligence services, already overwhelmed trying to assess Allied air and ground capabilities, lacked the resources to thoroughly investigate artillery technologies. The few technical intelligence reports that did describe Allied counter-battery systems were classified at high levels and didn't reach tactical commanders, who needed the information. Third, and most damaging, German military culture had developed an institutional arrogance about technical matters. Germany had pioneered so many military technologies, submarines, jet aircraft, guided missiles, advanced tanks that many officers couldn't conceive of Allied superiority in any technical field. Reports of impossible Allied capabilities were dismissed as exaggeration or attributed to conventional explanations rather than technological revolution. This intelligence failure had a brutal simplicity. German flak crews continued operating under tactical doctrines that assumed they had time to fire, assess results, and displace if under counter-battery fire. Allied technological advances had eliminated that time cushion. By the time crews realized they were under fire, the bombardment was already at maximum intensity. The ammunition used in Allied counter-battery missions contributed to the devastating effectiveness. Against flak positions, Allied artillery typically used a mix of high-explosive shells with instantaneous fuses and proximity-fused ammunition when available. The instantaneous fuses ensured shells exploded on contact with any surface, maximizing fragmentation effect against exposed personnel and light structures. Proximity-fused shells, which exploded automatically when passing near any object, were particularly devastating against flak crews because they detonated above the position, raining fragments downward into open gun emplacements where crews couldn't take cover. A typical counter-battery mission against a German heavy flak battery might involve 4 to 6 Allied artillery battalions firing in coordination, delivering several hundred shells within 5 to 10 minutes. This saturation bombardment ensured destruction even if some shells missed the sheer volume of fire covered the entire position and surrounding area. The Germans called this drum fire, a term carried over from World War I, describing bombardments so intense that shell explosions created a continuous rolling sound like drums. Against fixed positions like flak batteries, drum fire from multiple Allied artillery battalions was essentially unsurvivable for anyone caught in the open. The casualty patterns documented in surviving German medical records from 1944 reveal the brutal nature of this warfare. Of flak personnel killed by Allied fire, approximately 70% died from fragmentation wounds, shell splinters that tore through flesh and caused massive bleeding. 20% died from blast effects over pressure waves that ruptured internal organs even when no visible wounds existed. The remaining 10% died from direct hits, being literally blown apart by shell impacts. For the wounded, the fragmentation wounds were particularly horrific. Artillery shell fragments were irregular pieces of jagged metal, often red-hot from the explosion, that tumbled through the air, causing devastating wounds far worse than bullets. Men hit by multiple fragments often died from blood loss before medical help could arrive. Those who survived faced lengthy evacuations and often permanent disabilities. The German medical system, already overwhelmed by casualties from multiple fronts, struggled to handle the volume of wounded flak personnel. Field hospitals near active flak positions operated in constant crisis, receiving waves of casualties that overwhelmed available surgeons and supplies. The wounded often spent hours or days awaiting treatment, with predictable consequences for survival rates. Gefreiter Weber, who survived Anzio, described the aftermath of one particularly heavy counter-battery bombardment in March 1944. The American shells fell for perhaps 8 minutes. When the bombardment stopped, I emerged from the ammunition bunker where I had taken cover. The position looked like the surface of the moon craters everywhere. Equipment destroyed, pieces of bodies scattered across the area. We had 23 men in the position when the bombardment began. We found 11 dead. 8 were wounded seriously. 4 of us were unhurt by some miracle. The wounded were screaming. Some had lost limbs. Others had belly wounds that meant they would die slowly. Our medical orderly had been killed in the first minute of the bombardment. We had no morphine, no bandages beyond what men carried personally. It took 3 hours for medics to arrive from the battalion aid station. By then, 2 of the wounded had died. The medics said they had been delayed because the Americans were bombarding all roads leading to the front. The wounded were evacuated that night, loaded into trucks that drove without lights to avoid American aircraft. Of the 8 wounded, I later learned that 3 died during evacuation or at the field hospital. The remaining 5 were sent to Germany for long-term treatment. None ever returned to combat duty. From our battery of 23 men, only 4 remained effective after that single bombardment. Such catastrophic casualty rates forced the Luftwaffe to constantly feed replacements into flak units, creating a death spiral of inexperienced crews facing technological challenges they couldn't understand or counter. By late 1944, many flak batteries consisted almost entirely of teenagers with minimal training and elderly men recalled from reserve status, commanded by the few surviving experienced personnel. The training crisis compounded the casualty problem. Effective flak gunnery required mathematical ability, mechanical aptitude, physical strength to handle heavy ammunition, and the ability to function under extreme stress. These qualities were exactly what the Wehrmacht needed for tank crews, aircraft pilots, and elite infantry. The Luftwaffe's flak arm, assigned defensive missions seen as less critical than offensive operations, received lower quality personnel while being asked to operate some of Germany's most technically demanding weapons. The teenagers and older men crewing flak batteries by 1944 often lacked the education needed to understand ballistic calculations or the physical strength to maintain sustained fire rates. They learned on the job, under fire, with predictable results for both effectiveness and casualties. Many replacement crew members survived only days or weeks before being killed or wounded, never achieving the experience needed for effective gunnery. The women serving in flak units, primarily as radar operators, telephone personnel, and searchlight crews, faced similar dangers despite not directly manning the guns. When Allied counter-battery fire hit a position, it made no distinction between combat personnel and support personnel. Female auxiliaries died alongside male gun crews, a fact the Nazi propaganda apparatus struggled to explain given its ideology about women's roles. Luftwaffe personnel records, where they survive in fragmentary form, document the scale of this catastrophe. The 4th Flak Division, defending Berlin, reported in December 1944 that it had received 3,400 replacement personnel since January of that year to maintain a rated strength of 6,000. This meant the division had suffered casualties exceeding 50% and required constant reinforcement simply to maintain manning levels. Similar patterns appeared across all flak divisions. The 1st Flak Corps, defending the Ruhr industrial region, reported casualties of 43% of rated strength during 1944. The 2nd Flak Division, protecting Vienna, suffered 39% casualties. These figures represent only documented losses. Actual casualties, including men who died before being recorded or who were listed as missing, were certainly higher. The impact on morale was devastating. Unlike infantry soldiers who could take cover in trenches or tank, crews who had armor protection, flak crews operated in open positions where they had minimal protection against artillery fire. They couldn't fight back effectively against the weapon killing them. Their guns were designed for anti-aircraft fire, not counter-battery duels. They were essentially helpless victims once Allied artillery had their position registered. Unteroffizier Paul Schneider, who served in a flak battery near Cologne from September 1944 until the city's capture in March 1945, described the psychological state of his unit. "We called ourselves the living dead. We knew statistically that we would all be killed or wounded within weeks. Every time we fired our guns, we waited for the American shells to arrive. Some men broke mentally and refused to serve the guns. Others became fatalistic, almost welcoming death as an end to fear. The worst part was knowing it was meaningless. We rarely hit American bombers. They flew too high and too fast. When we did hit one, 10 more would arrive the next day. But each time we fired, Americans would destroy part of our position. We were dying to accomplish nothing. That knowledge, more than the danger, destroyed morale. Schneider's battery suffered 84 casualties from an authorized strength of 48 during 6 months of operations, a casualty rate of 175%. The position was reinforced repeatedly, and those replacements suffered similar casualties in a grinding attrition that consumed men faster than the training system could provide replacements. The Allied advantage extended beyond technology to doctrine and organization. American and British artillery doctrine emphasized massed fires, concentrating multiple batteries against single targets to ensure destruction. Counter-battery fire received high priority, with dedicated units assigned to locate and destroy enemy artillery. German artillery doctrine, developed during the war's mobile phase, emphasized flexibility and rapid displacement. This worked well for field artillery supporting advancing ground forces, but flak batteries defending cities and industrial facilities couldn't employ such tactics. They were fixed defenses, facing an enemy who had developed perfect weapons for destroying fixed defenses. The organizational differences were equally significant. Allied artillery operated with detailed communications networks, centralized fire direction, and extensive logistical support. German artillery, increasingly isolated as Allied air superiority severed communications, operated more independently with less coordination. This meant Allied batteries could mass fires from multiple directions against German positions, while German artillery rarely achieved similar concentration. The material advantages were overwhelming. The United States alone produced over 100,000 artillery pieces during the war and enormous quantities of ammunition. Germany produced approximately 43,000 artillery pieces total and faced chronic ammunition shortages from 1943 onward. Allied gunners could fire hundreds of rounds per day in counter-battery missions. German gunners often rationed ammunition carefully due to shortages. The combination of technological superiority, doctrinal advantages, organizational efficiency, and material abundance created an impossible situation for German flak crews. They faced enemies who could locate them instantly, engage them immediately with massed fires, and sustain bombardments that consumed ammunition at rates German industry couldn't match. The casualty statistics, though incomplete, document the scale of the disaster. Of approximately 1 million personnel who served in Luftwaffe flak units during the war, estimated casualties exceeded 450,000, with approximately 120,000 killed, 200,000 wounded, and 130,000 missing or captured. The casualty rate of 45% overall masked much higher rates for personnel serving in heavy flak batteries on the Western and Italian fronts, where Allied counter-battery capabilities were most developed. For crew members serving in heavy flak batteries facing sustained Allied ground attack, the casualty rates approached 80 to 90%. These men, operating the most sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons Germany possessed, suffered losses comparable to infantry assault units or U-boat crews, the most dangerous assignments in their respective services. The flak towers in German cities represented the ultimate expression of static defense doctrine and suffered accordingly. These massive concrete structures, built in Berlin, Hamburg, Vienna, and other cities, mounted numerous heavy flak guns on elevated platforms and sheltered thousands of civilians in their lower levels. The walls were up to 3.5 meters thick, designed to resist heavy bombs. What the towers couldn't resist was sustained counter-battery fire. While the structures themselves survived bombardment, the gun crews operating on exposed platforms suffered terrible casualties. Allied artillery, particularly the American 155mm long tom guns, could range the towers from positions outside the cities and subject them to harassment fire that made the gun positions death traps. Survivor accounts from the Berlin flak towers describe constant terror. Crews would man the guns during air raids, knowing Allied artillery observers were watching for muzzle flashes. Minutes after engaging bombers, artillery fire would blanket the tower, killing and wounding crew members who couldn't take cover while operating their weapons. The thick concrete walls that protected civilians below provided no protection for gunners on the exposed platforms above. The final irony of the German flak arms destruction was that the weapons themselves remained technically texellation, effective throughout the war. An 88mm flak gun from 1945 could hit aircraft just as effectively as one from 1939. What changed was not German weapon capability, but Allied ability to locate and destroy the crews operating those weapons before they could achieve significant effect. The German High Command recognized the casualty crisis in flak units, but proved unable to develop effective countermeasures. Proposals to increase mobility of heavy flak batteries, founded on the technical impossibility of making 7-ton guns rapidly movable. Suggestions to reduce engagement rates to limit exposure to counter-battery fire conflicted with the desperate need to disrupt Allied bombing campaigns. Plans to decentralize flak defenses and accept lower effectiveness in exchange for better survivability came too late to implement before Germany's final collapse. The legacy of this catastrophe extended beyond the immediate casualties. The destruction of flak crews represented the annihilation of technical expertise Germany desperately needed. The men operating flak guns possessed mechanical and mathematical skills valuable for maintaining increasingly complex German weapons systems. Their deaths contributed to the broader collapse of German technical capability in the war's final year. The psychological impact spread beyond flak units. Other branches of the Wehrmacht watched the systematic destruction of flak crews and drew conclusions about German inability to counter Allied technological advantages. The knowledge that even the most protected, most technically advanced defensive positions could be located and destroyed by enemies who remained invisible contributed to the spreading sense of hopelessness that characterized German military morale in 1945. The Allied counter-battery campaign against German flak achieved strategic effects far beyond the crews killed and guns destroyed. By making flak defense suicidal, it forced the Germans into an impossible choice: cease anti-aircraft fire and allow uncontested Allied bombing, or continue firing and accept unsustainable casualties. Germany attempted the latter and lost the experienced crews needed to operate their weapons effectively, leading inevitably to reduced defensive effectiveness and the collapse of air defenses by early 1945. The technological advantage that enabled this achievement, the integration of radar, sound ranging, flash spotting, and automated fire control into a unified system, represented one of the war's most significant but least recognized developments. While dramatic weapons like the atomic bomb or jet aircraft captured attention, the unglamorous counter-battery systems destroyed German defensive capability methodically and enabled the Allied strategic bombing campaign that devastated German industry. For the men who served in German flak crews, the experience meant death that came without warning and couldn't be avoided. They stood at their guns, performed their duties, and died not from lack of courage or skill, but because they faced enemies with technological advantages they couldn't match and often couldn't even perceive. The crews around Anzio, the batteries defending the Ruhr, the gunners on the flak towers, all shared the experience of fighting a war where doing their jobs meant certain death. The 89% casualty rate in German flak batteries facing sustained Allied counter-battery fire represented not the cost of military incompetence but the price of technological inferiority. Germany had entered the war with military and technical advantages in many areas. By 1944, those advantages had evaporated, replaced by Allied superiority so complete that German defensive forces faced systematic annihilation regardless of their courage, training, or tactical skill. The story of the flak crews who died under Allied counter-battery fire is a story of ordinary men, destroyed by forces they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't escape. They performed their duties until death claimed them, and their deaths accomplished nothing beyond delaying inevitable defeat. In their destruction lay a larger truth. Technological superiority, once achieved, proves nearly impossible to overcome through traditional military virtues. The flak crews learned this lesson definitively, paying with their lives for Germany's failure to match Allied advances in radar, fire control, and industrial production. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.